Good evening, everyone, and welcome, all of you, to the lovely Scotiabank Theatre Auditorium here at St. Mary's, and also to all of you on our live stream audience. Let's first acknowledge our presence this evening on the traditional lands of the Mi'kmaq, the ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq Nation. I'm Chris Stover, the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Ethics in Public Affairs. Co-founded by St. Mary's University and the Atlantic School of Theology, CCEPA was created in 2002 in an effort to keep the consideration of ethics alive and well in the public dialogue. And we do this through presentations like this, through the collaborative model with a wide variety of groups and organizations. So thank you to all of you for coming tonight and being part of the very first event in CCEPA's 16th program season. Your loyal participation, and in some cases, new support, is greatly appreciated. We've talked about a lot of things in the public square over the last 16 years. But in all that time, oddly, never specifically about what it means to do the right thing in terms of international affairs at home and abroad, and specifically what Canada's role is in that sphere and what it should be. But we're doing that tonight. Bob Rae, Canada's special envoy to Myanmar, is here with us to examine those questions. Questions like, does Canada do enough? Does Canada do the right thing in the countries that it engages with? And what is the right thing, especially in places where there's difficulty? When I spoke to Bob on the phone a couple of months ago about what CCEPA hoped to achieve with this talk, I was prepared, as I always am with speakers, to plead and sometimes cajole and say, could you just say ethics or values or morals when you get to the talk, because that's what we do. But I didn't have to do that on this call. Bob Rae was all about why values matter in international affairs. So it's been quite a pleasure and a privilege to work on and bring this event to you in collaboration with the McEachern Institute for Public Policy and Governance. It's also generously supported by the good folks at the Canadian International Council and for the Study of Security and Development at Dalhousie University. So I'm now going to turn things over to Dr. Kevin Quigley, who's the scholarly director at the McEachern Institute. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you, Chris. Good evening, everybody. Our keynote speaker, who I will introduce shortly, will speak for approximately 45 minutes. Following that, we'll open up the floor for a 30-minute question and answer to allow you, the audience, both here in person and also online, to participate. So a few words about the Honourable Bob Rae. Born in Ottawa and a graduate of both the University of Toronto and Oxford, Bob Rae was first elected to the Parliament of Canada as a Member of Parliament for Broadview in by-election in October 1978. He was re-elected in 1979 and 80 and resigned his seat in 82 when elected leader of the Ontario New Democratic Party, where he led the first NDP government in Ontario's history. He was elected to the Legislative Assembly for the riding of York South in 82, re-elected in 85, 87, 1990, and 1995. After more than a decade as a partner at Goodman's, Bob returned to federal politics as the MP for Toronto Centre in 2008, first in a by-election and then in a general election in that year and then in 2011. Bob resigned his seat in 2013 to become senior partner at Olthius Clear Townsend, where he works with First Nations as legal counsel, advisor, and negotiator. In addition to his legal practice, Bob teaches at the University of Toronto as a Distinguished Senior Fellow at the School of Public Policy and Governance, and as a Distinguished Professor at Victoria College. I'll also note he is an advisor on the advisory board of the McEachern Institute, and we're also very grateful for that. He has written 5 books and 2 major reports, one on the Air India bombing and one on higher education in Ontario. Bob served as Ontario's 21st Premier from 1990 to 1995 and interim federal leader of the Liberal Party in 2011 to 2013. He was named Queen's Counsel in 84, appointed to the Privy Council of Canada in 1998, named an officer of the Order of Canada in 2000, received the Order of Ontario in 2004, and Companion of the Order of Canada in 2015. In October 2017, Bob was appointed as Special Envoy to Myanmar by Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. As Special Envoy, Bob addresses the urgent need to resolve the humanitarian and security crisis in Myanmar, as well as the situation affecting vulnerable populations, including the Rohingya Muslim community, other religious and ethnic minorities, and women and girls. He also advises the Prime Minister on how Canada can best support efforts to respond to the needs of those affected and displaced by the recent violence. Please join me in welcoming our special guest tonight, the Honourable Bob Rae.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure and privilege to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity very, very much. I'm somewhat daunted by the size of the audience. I've often said that as a leader of the New Democratic Party in Ontario in the 1980s, this size of crowd is not something with which I'm at all familiar. But I'm delighted that so many of you are here tonight. I want to just emphasize that I hope very much we have a good discussion because these issues are complex. They're not simplistic, but they, I think, reflect a tension that all of us who've been involved in public life and in public affairs feel almost every day. And I recall a conversation I had with a very dear friend who's a writer and novelist, and she was describing a situation in which she found herself, and she said, you know, I had to make a difficult choice as to whether I should do the right thing or whether I should do the political thing. And I looked at her and I said, you know how insulting that sentence actually is? I mean, you know what that means? It means that if I've dirtied my hands in the political process for as long as I have, it means I haven't been doing the right thing, which many of you no doubt will feel. But it also, I think, is a serious mistake because it presumes that ethical decisions are impractical decisions, and that practical decisions are unethical decisions. And I have always thought, as long as I've been sort of semi-conscious and thinking about these things, is that the point is to be guided by a morality that is at once ethical and practical, and that doing good in the world is not gobbledygook. It actually means something. And then we talk as Canadians about doing good in the world. We don't just mean doing good somewhere else far away, but we mean doing good at home. The most famous mayor ever of Toronto, William Lyon Mackenzie, who was our first mayor, pointed out once in a famous speech where he said, charity begins at home, but it does not end there. And I think without getting into too much, dare I say it, theology, it is exceptionally important for us to allow ourselves to be judged ethically, but also to understand that ethical principles can sometimes take us in different directions. And it isn't necessarily the case to say, I have the ethical answer, and here it is, and this is the path upon which it takes us, and here is the unethical path on which to take. And conversely, one of the lessons that I learned in politics, and it was a lesson most intensely felt in government, and I know that Premier Dexter will feel the same way as I do, is that sometimes in political life, you have to make a choice between doing a terrible thing and doing an even worse thing. And that's the very difficult ethical calculation you sometimes have to make in government, and you sometimes have to make in politics, as we do in all walks of life. I feel it's very important for us to understand that the ethical case that we make relates to our own personal behavior, but it also relates to our collective behavior. It's not confined to how we are as individuals, but it also applies to what we do collectively and how we do it. And I want to come back to a very basic point, which is that it's not always easy. But the fact that it isn't easy is no reason not to try to do it. And if we fail or fall short, that's not a reason to stop. That's a reason to carry on through. Many of you may be familiar with the very famous book about international politics and diplomacy, written by Henry Kissinger. And that book's called Diplomacy. And in that book, Kissinger presents what I think is a completely false dichotomy between practicality and morals. He draws a line between, let's say, Woodrow Wilson and Jimmy Carter on one side, who he says were driven by principles of morality, and let's say Theodore Roosevelt and Richard Nixon and himself, who were driven by a different set of principles based on practicality. You won't be shocked to learn that Kissinger ended up having a rather dim view of the politics and philosophies of Woodrow Wilson and Jimmy Carter, and a much more generous view about his own behavior and those that he felt were more practically oriented in how they behaved. And I say it's a false dichotomy because, just to repeat myself a tad at the outset, it's important to, I think, appreciate, and this is particularly true in our own age now, that it is really impossible not to apply a moral judgment to the decisions that we make. And it's equally wrong to assert that our moral judgment only leads to one conclusion. I want to try to draw some practical analogies and comparisons. I want to talk not only about our foreign policy, but also our domestic policy. And I want to connect them all together, which is a bit of a high challenge in the roughly 37 minutes I think I now have left in the time allocated to me. In the debate today, we often talk about the principles of democracy, the principles of liberty, freedom, the traditions of human rights. And we need to understand the tension between all of these things and the rule of law that we are trying to establish in the world as the basis upon which we need to go forward. I happen to believe that one of the primary things that's required in order for people to be able to engage effectively in the civil process in their own countries, wherever they may be, is that there is an initial requirement of some degree of order. And so I start by going back to a philosopher who might not be seen as one who was particularly ethical in his observations, but I believe at some profound level he was. And that philosopher, of course, is Thomas Hobbes. Hobbes was writing at the time of the English Civil War, and he was fighting at a time when Protestantism and Catholicism were at each other's throats, something which is incomprehensible to the citizens of Halifax who would never know of such a phenomenon. Hobbes spent the Civil War in Holland, and this allowed him to have a certain sense of observation and detachment as he looked at the level of destruction, the level of passion, and the level of violence which was overtaking the society that he loved and of which he was a part. And Hobbes concluded, to put it in the most simplistic terms, was that it was necessary for the English people, as it would be for others, to set aside their religious differences in the name of order, in order to allow them to practice their religion, in order to allow them to make a living, in order to allow them to have a life that would be other than nasty, brutish, and short. It was essential that people accept the need for a sovereign who would have an effective monopoly of civil power. Now, Hobbes is often seen as an advocate of tyranny, and I think that's a profound mistake. Hobbes was really saying that in order for any kind of civil society to exist, there has to be some kind of order. There has to be some acceptance of authority. And there has to be a willingness to agree that no matter how profound our differences between us, we will not allow those differences to take over the public space. And so we will allow for religious difference. We will accept the fact that people have profound theological arguments. But in order for us to carry on as a society, we have to agree that we won't kill each other because we have different theological views. Now, you might think, is Hobbes writing about the 17th century, or is he writing about the 21st century? Because we have to appreciate that in many parts of the world, we have not yet reached the point where people agree that religion is a matter of the private sphere, and that the public space is a place where we agree to disagree. And actually, it took Europe a very, very long time to agree to that. And once they'd agreed to it on the question of religion, they then fell apart again on the profound questions of ideology, totalitarianism, communism, Nazism, to the point where the 20th century became the most violent century in all of human history. And at the end of that war, there began a slow and painful process by which people decided and agreed that, in fact, they wanted to have a world that was governed by the rule of law, in which power was tempered by principle, and in which we would accept the premise that the nation state alone cannot be the sole determinant of how power will be exercised in the world. Now, some of you notice that I am describing the world in somewhat different ways than that used by our friend, the President of the United States, in his speech to the United Nations just 2 days ago. You would be absolutely correct. And one of the things we have to understand as Canadians is when we do right in the world, we have to be able to express our differences of opinion with our closest neighbor, with our traditional ally, and with a country that is 10 times larger than ours, and that is our largest trading partner anywhere in the world. So every time we articulate a different view of the nature of world politics, of how we will govern ourselves, of how we will resolve disputes, of what is the position of the nation state, we need to understand and appreciate that we are disagreeing with our neighbors to the south, who have a lot more power than we do. And there are those who say, well, we shouldn't be saying these things because we're in the middle of a very difficult trade negotiation. And in the middle of that trade negotiation, it's a bad idea to say anything that indicates that we disagree. Well, the problem with that thinking is that if we stifle ourselves, if we fail to express this different vision that we have, we in fact sell ourselves short, and we also, I think, don't advance the extent of our national interest in trying to explain to our American friends why a country that is much, much smaller than this larger country would say, how could we not find a way to say that there must be some process by which we deal with the differences between us that are not simply expressed by the fact that might is right. So Hobbes said, yeah, you got to have might. You've got to have this central authority. But ever since Hobbes, we've been trying to infuse that authority with a sense of public morality. And that public morality is complicated because it's based on the principle that there are not necessarily absolute truths that may be deeply theological in nature that we can get everybody to agree on, but there are some practical truths that we have to agree on domestically and then agree on internationally. We accept the notion, for example, that simply because you're the wealthiest person on the street doesn't mean that you're necessarily going to get the best health care. We've made a decision as a country that we're going to do whatever we can to take the cash nexus out of who gets access to care. We've applied principles of morality to what is, after all, a very basic social service on the premise that no matter how wealthy you are, you will have equal access to health care. Now, let's not, before we start patting ourselves too much on the back and saying we've discovered how to do this as a country, let's also remember what we've done for health care, we have not done for housing. What we've done for health care, we have not done for many other things. There's still a tremendous amount of inequality in our society. Nevertheless, there is no question that our decision to organize healthcare in a certain way is a profoundly ethical decision. It's a moral decision that we've made as a society. That's why Premier Romano, our good friend, referred to it as one of the defining moments of Canadian citizenship, and it is. But we also need to be honest with ourselves and say there are many parts of our lives as Canadians where we have very imperfectly come to this view of morality. And perhaps the simplest one, or the most basic one in our own country at the moment, I believe, is the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people. And here, I think we have to understand something about ourselves as Canadians that actually links us with the experience of most other countries in the world. And that is that we are the product of imperialism. We're the product of colonialism. We're the product of a moment in time in European history when several countries decided that the world they were living in Europe was not big enough for them, that there was too much to explore, too much to see, too much to observe, and they entered into this period of tremendous expansion. An expansion which brought them to the shores of the Americas, where they discovered to their shock and surprise that they had not found China or India, but they had found a continent that was already occupied by other people. And it wasn't just occupied by a few people. We often talk about the wilderness. We talk about the empty spaces, the great empty swaths of land which existed here. Most studies today are showing very clearly that there were tens of millions of people living in the Americas. That Cusco, where people now go on holiday to visit the civilization of the Incas, Cusco was a city of 500,000 people, the largest city in all of the Americas, one of the largest cities in the world. And we're only now just beginning to appreciate and understand the extent of the civilizations that lived here, of the ways of life that existed here. We quite appropriately now start many, many public functions, as we did tonight, with recognizing that there were people who were here before settlers arrived. But we need to understand a little more about those societies, and we're just beginning to understand and appreciate their complexity, their diversity, their size, their richness, and their quality. And we need to understand something which has been pointed out over many times in the last several decades, is that this continent, in effect, these continents were stolen back. And we need to understand the implications of that. Stephen Harper once said that, Canada's great advantage in world politics was that we had no colonial experience. Nothing could be further from the truth. I think we all know what he was saying. What he was saying was we have no imperial ambitions. Well, actually, we've had them for quite a long time. The imperial ambition that we had, that the French had, that the British had, and then as that dispute was settled, that as more and more people came to this continent, that we all had, was our imperial ambition. It was, we're going to take the whole thing. We're going to take the whole land. We're going to claim the Arctic, even though most people here have not even been to the Arctic. We're going to say that's ours. And so we're in the process today as a country of coming to terms with this colonial past and present, because it's not just a past, it's very complicated. We need to understand that we are, most of us, a nation of settlers who've come here with now a small minority, crushed by disease, crushed by superior military power, crushed by sheer numbers coming in and moving people to the margins. This is who we are as Canadians. It's not an entirely pretty picture. I say this not to make us all feel guilty, but to simply put in perspective the fact that when we talk to other countries in the world, we need to understand who we really are and how we really connect to the rest of the globe. We're as much a part of building this post-colonial structure as any other country in the world. The only difference between us and South Africa is that the Indigenous population in South Africa is much, much bigger than the settler population. And in our own country, the Indigenous population is tiny compared to the settler population. And that difference means everything. Where does morality fit into this? Well, I suspect that our 19th century ancestors would have said, what we are doing is civilizing and moralizing. What we are doing is bringing a superior civilization and a superior theology to people who've been deprived of that theology. When I now teach at Victoria College at the University of Toronto, when I go into the theological college at Vic, there's these wonderful names on the wall of where all the missionaries are going at the beginning of the 20th century. Some are going to India, some are going to Bengal, some are going to Africa, various places, and some are going to Keewatin and to northern Canada. It was the same idea, same principle. It makes us feel a little uncomfortable today, But we need to understand and embrace, and this is what the whole meaning of reconciliation is that it's based on an understanding that terrible things were done in the name of civilization. Terrible things were done in the name of morality and in the name of ethics. I believe they taught ethics in the theological school at Victoria College at the end of the 19th century. I'm sure they did. So we have to be careful about understanding the nature of the morality that we preach and what its potential consequences can be. And in our own time, we're now wrestling with a legal structure and a constitutional structure which is slowly but surely trying to come to terms with the impact of this, what Chief Justice McLaughlin has described as this cultural genocide. In many respects, it's not just a cultural genocide. If you look at the UN definitions of what is a genocide, something we've been debating in Canada with respect to Myanmar, which I'll come to in just a second, we need to understand and appreciate to what extent we are part of a bigger problem and a bigger set of issues. Before turning my attention a little further afield from Canada, I just want to say one final thing about our situation as a country. It's not enough now for us to say, I'm sorry. It's not enough now for us to say we recognize that we did something wrong. It's necessary for us to understand the price that still has to be paid. And to understand that there now are as many children living in care as there were living in residential schools. That we have not taken the necessary steps financially, economically, socially, politically, to actually meet the nature of the challenge that we face. It's a journey we've just barely starting. And yes, it requires an ethical test, because if we just go by what does the majority want to do, what are most people prepared to do? Well, go out and knock on some doors and say, we're going to increase your taxes by 15% a year for the next while because we've got a price to pay for what we've done. But we need to understand that if what you do does not match what you know to be true, then you're not acting ethically. You can give the greatest speeches and the most wonderful sermons, and you can feel as an individual that you're truly sorry and you're taking the steps, but you've got to understand that it takes and requires political action, and takes and requires political leadership. And that has to be exercised in a way that's fundamentally infused with a practical morality that understands that mistakes have consequences, and that there's things that we need to do collectively to move forward, and that, yes, there is a price to be paid. I mentioned just a little while ago that we need to understand the extent to which we're part of this broader experience, this global experience. And in part, my talk is a bit of a reflection of a question that I was asked the other day, saying, Bob, your life is a bit confused these days. You're doing Indigenous law here, and you're going to Myanmar over there, and what are you up to? That's not a bad question to ask somebody heading into his, 8th decade. I've been a rising star in 6 of those decades, so I feel pretty good. I took a great deal of comfort, by the way, when Prime Minister Mahathir made a comeback at the age of 94 in Malaysia. And I was talking to Mr. Chrétien about it, and we both looked at each other and said, yeah, we got a while to go yet. It's not quite over yet. And the more I thought about it, the more I think that part of what we're dealing with here is the nature of the world order, the nature of human rights in that order, and the consequences of empire. What empire does and how empires respond. The crisis in Myanmar is about the consequences of empire. That's a simple way of saying it, but really, when you look at it, you realize that, first of all, you had a Bamar kingdom that was an ancient kingdom in what is now Myanmar, Burma, on both sides of the Irrawaddy River, which is the big river system that is the spine that flows through Myanmar. The Bamars were the most advanced in terms of their command of arms, and they dominated that part of the world. Except the British came in, and they were an even bigger empire, and they took them over. And in doing so, the British decided that there really was no line between Burma and India, and that they could rule the whole show from one place. And so there was an Indian empire that was part of the British Empire, but there was no line between India and Burma. So when there's no line, people move around. And there had long been Muslims living in Myanmar, living on the coast as traders, living as farmers, but the numbers increased during the time of the British. And therein lies the situation, because when the British Empire decides we can't afford to do this anymore after 1945, and we're getting out of here, we all know the consequences of the departure from India and how violent the consequences of that were. But what we don't really understand is that there was another consequence in Burma, because the leaders of the Burmese nationalist movement, led by Aung San, who was the father of Aung San Suu Kyi, said it's Burma for the Burmese. But what you need to understand is there's dozens of other groups, of other communities, of other ethnicities, of other communities and civilizations that were part of this world. And so they immediately said, whoa, we're being left at the mercy of this majority. And there were millions of Indians, Hindus, who lived in Burma, who were told, you're not welcome here. And so there was this steady process, consolidated by a military government in 1962, which basically said, we are going to retake our country, and we're going to remake our country in the name of what we were and what we aspire to be. And there has, since 1948, been a civil war in Burma ever since. And one community in particular has been now singled out as not being part of the country, not being a member of that family, not having the rights of citizenship. And so the largest stateless population in the world are the Rohingyas. Even the name is not to be spoken in Myanmar. Why is that? Why is it that they're called Bengalis and not Rohingya? Because Rohingya, in the local language, means I am a person from Rakhine. I am from Rakhine. Who are you? I'm Rohingya. I'm from Rakhine. This is my home. And the Myanmaris, the Burmese, say, no, 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 no. If you say that, you're asserting that you belong here. And when we call you Bengalis, we call you Bengalis because it means you don't belong here. You belong on the other side of the bay. That's where you're from. Well, 200 years ago, that's where you're from. And when you think about it, Canadians, and particularly Atlantic Canadians, should have a special understanding of what this means. Because we not only had an issue of genocide with respect to Aboriginal Canadians, we also had an issue of genocide with respect to Acadians. The forcible deportation of the Acadians was a crime against humanity if we apply our current standards to what took place. The International Criminal Court has just said we are going to look into the issue of the forcible deportation of the Rohingya, because forcible deportation is one of the named crimes against humanity in the Rome Statute. So As a country, we have actually been on a path since 1945. A path that we followed very imperfectly domestically. We've had tremendous trouble embracing all of our history, all of our past, all of our present. We've had difficulty actually achieving the moral and political objectives we want to achieve because they're difficult, they're expensive, they're politically controversial, and they're not always popular. We need to be honest with ourselves in understanding why is this so difficult. Internationally, it's the same. We've been trying to create a fragile international architecture that's based on the principle of the rule of law, not the rule of laws. It's easy to have a country that's run by the rule of laws. Nazi Germany had laws. Every effective sovereignty has laws. But when we talk about the rule of law, we're talking about an evolution that takes us from Hobbes to liberalism to constitutionalism to an understanding that order on its own, power on its own, might on its own is not good enough because it doesn't reflect the depth of our humanity and it doesn't reflect the depth of our commitment to the sovereignty of the individual personality and to the groups to which that personality, that individual, decides to join and to adhere. This was the international experience that came out of 1945, and we were very much part of that architecture. We were, to borrow the famous phrase of Dean Acheson, we were present at that creation. A Canadian was one of the architects of the International Declaration of Human Rights. A Canadian was active in the creation of the Rome Statute and the establishment of the International Criminal Court. We have been committed to multilateralism, to multilateral institutions, and to an international concept known as the rule of law. And we have been committed to doing this in the name of a morality that is at once clear but also extremely practical. But actually, what we're missing now, and what we're still missing in the world today, we're missing a lot of things, but one of the key things that we're missing is the institutions that can actually execute and carry out the implications of the architecture that we have created. In other words, we haven't been able to follow through consequentially on the morality that we have tried to embed into institutions. So there's a huge frustration in the world. We see injustice, and we have tremendous difficulty responding to it. We see terrible violence, and we have tremendous problems intervening and finding the methods by which we can stop the violence. And I think this gap between what we know should be done, and any community with the rule of law, you say, well, you have a rule of law, but you also have institutions. You have police forces. You have people who can come in and say, if there's a civil dispute, you have to have the means of implementing the rule of law. We're missing that. And the fact that we're missing it is what is creating a gap of credibility about our moral principles. You say you have moral principles, but you can't actually implement them. You say that you're going to save future generations from the scourge of war, which is in the preamble to the Charter of the United Nations. But the story since 1945 is that we have not been able to save generations from the scourge of war. In fact, war has had more of a profound impact on the civilian populations than we would have said took place, let's say, in the First World War, where civilian populations were remarkably, relatively unaffected. It was the young men that we sent out into this terrible battle who bore the full price of the conflict. But now it's everybody. We face the largest refugee crisis today that we have faced since the end of the Second World War. There are more people in camps today than there were in 1945. Are our aid budgets responding to the degree of that crisis? No. Are we fully prepared to live up to all the standards that we have set? No. Apparently not. But I don't say this to simply criticize or to create despair, because in many respects we're doing a lot. We're engaging significantly, but is it enough? No, it is not. What I think is positive is that we are less afraid today as a country to describe what is going on than we were before. The world did not describe what happened in Rwanda as a genocide until it was over. In Rakhine State, the fact-finding mission of the United Nations, you can get the report online. It came out last week. It's 400 pages long. It should be required reading for anybody who wants to understand what has happened. We now have substantial documentation of the extent to which crimes of war were committed, the extent to which rape was used as a means of intimidation, the extent to which people were killed and other lives are threatened. And so there's no excuse for us to say we didn't know, or we don't know, or we're not aware. But we also need to understand something else. And this is that there's a difference between describing something and then figuring out, what do we do about it? And that's where we have to deal with the fact that our ethics and our rights are implemented not in a world in which knights of shining armor can come down and say, here's the answer. We will bring you peace. It's bloody complicated. China is the closest neighbor to Myanmar. Do you think China is going to sit back and on its very borders is going to say, that's a great idea to bring the foreign troops in to protect the Rakhine population? I mean, we have to understand the importance of consequential thinking and practical thinking, as well as ethical thinking. And we need to understand that ethics doesn't always take us only in one direction. And I'll perhaps close with this because I know we want to have some time for questions. When I was leader of the Liberal Party briefly, I had the occasion to meet with two political leaders. President Peres, who was president of Israel, and just 2 weeks before with Benjamin Netanyahu, who is the prime minister. And it was really an interesting set of conversations. The prime minister of Israel, Mr. Netanyahu, was fixated on the question of Iran. He gave another speech on it today, and I'm not for a moment suggesting that he's not right to be concerned about Iran, not to be worried about the impact of what Iran is doing in the Middle East. But for him, the important point was to denounce and to find the means of denunciation, and to continue to stress what needed to be done, up to and including bombing. And I listened with great interest, and I've raised some questions with him, and we went through the discussion. And then 2 weeks later, Mr. Peres came in, and I knew I was being a little bit mischievous because I knew that, these guys were not exactly joined at the hip. And they'd had a long history of conflict between them, and they were rivals in many respects. But I wanted to get President Peres's sense of the issue. And I said to him, Mr. President, when your prime minister was here, we talked a lot about Iran. He said, yes, I'm sure you did. And I had the impression from what Mr. Netanyahu said that he felt that some kind of military conflict was almost inevitable. And there was a long sort of silence. And Mr. Perez says, so let me understand this. So we drop a bomb on Iran. And then what? And there was a long pause. He said, that's the question. The question is our ability to think consequentially, to understand the consequences of what we do. And that's why I think it's a mistake to think that to describe a problem is to resolve it. No. To describe a problem accurately is to tell the truth as we see it. And then it's up to all of us to figure out the ways and means in which we might be able to achieve the objective which we seek to achieve. Recognizing that there is no perfect or easy solution, and that the ways of practicality and pragmatism are not always to be despised. And this is why I think, to come back to where I started, we really need to bring both strands in our tradition that Henry Kissinger described. We need to bring them together to understand that we need to think ethically, and we also need to think pragmatically and consequentially. And we need to hold this tension alive in ourselves all the time. It's the step from being a kid to being a grown-up. We can see lots of injustice in the world, but we have to take the human footsteps that allow us to say we're on the path to a better place. And we're thinking through all the consequences of action as well as all the consequences of inaction. And we're living with those things all the time in how we execute our policy. I suspect I've gone over my 45 minutes, but I'm delighted to be here, and I look forward to any questions you may have. I want to express my great thanks to St. Mary's University, to the Center for Ethics, to the McEachern Institute for their hospitality to me today, and to the great pleasure that I've had in speaking to you tonight. Thank you so much. Merci beaucoup.
Thanks so much, Bob. We are going to now turn to take questions from the floor. So I'd ask that people who have questions make their way down to the microphone, which is the couple of microphones we have lined up here. And we will, I think the ground rules are that in order to get as many questions as possible, we'd ask that you ask one question and perhaps no follow-up question, if that's possible. So, and we'll also be taking questions from our online audience. There's a possibility for people who are live streaming.
They have to shout louder, though.
That's right. They can send in their questions by sending an email to info@sasepa.ca or tweet at publicethicsca or send us a Facebook message, and we will be prompted with those questions from somebody here in front of me. So, to the floor.
Well, that just about wraps it up then, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The House of Commons today stripped Aung San Suu Kyi of her Canadian citizenship. If you were advising the government or the House of Commons on that decision, what would you have told them?
Well, first of all, I wasn't asked, so which I'm used to. It happens. I would have said a couple of things. I would have said, first of all, there needs to be a deliberative process by which we do this. And I don't think an instantaneous vote meets that test. I would have said, you need to understand the consequences of what you're doing. And we also need to understand that she's not a Canadian citizen. She received an honor of being an honorary Canadian citizen, which comes with zero privileges, no passport, no nothing. It's you know, it's like, so you say, okay, you can do that. Who does this, what does this say and what does it do? It's what I would call, it's a clear denunciation. It's an expression of outrage or of concern or whatever the House wants, however the House wants to call it. But it seems to me that we need to be thinking more deliberatively about, well, what are the consequences of that? What impact will it have? Who are we helping? Who are we hurting? No question, in my view, that the response of the Myanmar government, civilian, to the excesses of the military has been poor, inadequate, has not reflected the realities of the situation. But there's also, I don't think, a sufficient appreciation of exactly what's going on inside Myanmar and inside that society and inside that government. So we'll see what happens. We'll see what the consequences are, and we'll have to deal with them as they arise. There's no question that it reflects, I think, a strong opinion among Canadians. If you said, what do you think should happen? Should this person be an honorary Canadian citizen? And people would say, well, of course not. But you need to understand, well, how was it that she got it? Are you aware of the fact that she spent 20 years under house arrest, that she actually was a voice for democracy in a country that was deeply oppressed and run by a very vicious military dictatorship for a very long period of time? And now she finds herself in a government which she does not control. So I'm not advocating on her behalf. I'm just saying that if somebody were to have asked me, I would have said, well, why don't you try to create some deliberative process which reflects the implications of what you're doing? And I'm not sure we've done that. That's going to get me into trouble, by the way. So.
Please go ahead.
You mentioned China in your speech earlier.
Yeah. Yes.
You mentioned China earlier in your speech, so I was wondering, what exactly does China get in the way in the process of Burma, and how could it possibly get in the way of human rights in general and on the international scene, considering their massive economic power?
Well, that's the issue, isn't it? I mean, the issue is twofold. One is China is a very significant economic power globally, and in particular is a hugely significant economic power in Asia. It was the only country to have invested as much as they did between the years 1962 and right up to today in Myanmar. So we were piling on sanctions and piling on saying we can't do this, we can't do that. China was investing all kinds of money and resources into the Myanmar economy. They have a substantial influence in what goes on in that part of the world. They're a very significant source of investment and development assistance to the people of Myanmar. China has a very different view of human rights than we do. China believes that human rights is all about development, and human rights is all about improving the living conditions of masses of people. And when you consider what's happened in Chinese society, you realize that they've done a remarkable job of improving the living conditions of their people over the last 75 years. But we also have to recognize that they do not recognize individual freedoms the way we do, and the way, in fact, the International Declaration of Human Rights tells us that they're supposed to. So we have a profound difference with China. And the question really is, so what are we going to do about that? Are we going to stop our economic relations with China? Are we going to, how does it work? How does this all come together? And we also have to think very clearly about the fact that changing China's policies takes an incredible amount of time and persistence. The key thing is that we continue to do what we are in fact doing, which is to name the problems. So, for example, we look at what is happening with the Uyghur population in the western part of China, and we need to understand that that is a Muslim population that is living under a significant degree of political and security control, that there are hundreds of thousands of people who are either incarcerated or limited in terms of what they can say and do. And so when China sees a Muslim population in Myanmar that is facing great challenges, they're not about to leap in and say, oh, no, don't do that. That's not what's taking place. So China has a veto at the Security Council. So if we want to refer something to the International Criminal Court, China will have something to say about that. They have a veto on the Security Council. We're not even members yet of the Security Council. So we need to understand the power imbalance in that relationship.
I have a question from the online audience.
Okay.
Are we experiencing a moral shortfall in addressing climate change?
I think so. I think it's a moral issue as well as a political and economic issue. I think it's a moral issue because it's about, we talk often about the tragedy of the commons, where we recognize that in a world in which there's too much private exploitation, there's not enough being done for the common good and for the commons. But I think, as Mark Carney has said, he gave a great speech on this subject, our former bank governor and now the governor of the Bank of England, God bless him. He gave a very, very great speech on what he called the tragedy of the Rison. And that is to say, we are robbing from future generations. We are gobbling up so much that we're failing to pay attention to what we owe to not only to each other as we share this globe for now, but also what future generations will take. And we're doing incredible damage to the climate and to the planet. And reversing this is, again, going to take an absolutely heroic effort. And so, yes, it is an ethical question. It's also a practical question. What are you going to do? Are you prepared to pay more? Are you prepared to pay a tax? Are you prepared to undergo significant technological and other changes in order to begin this process of slowing down the pace of overheating and then actually figuring out a way to get back to a better place? We're not even close on that at the moment. So yeah, it's a moral issue as much as it is a political issue.
The first microphone?
A little tall here for me, but there we go. Thank you, first of all, for coming to speak with us tonight. My question is kind of just, I'm curious how you might respond to people who would argue that going into kind of, I guess, non-Western countries and enforcing human rights and things like this, people who might say that that's sort of a new colonialism, new imperialism, kind of imposing Western ideologies on those people who might not necessarily want to. What would you say to those people? How would you kind of counter that train of thought?
Well, it's complicated because there's no question that in the UN debates, many countries like India, for example, take a very dim view of the responsibility to protect and how things, when intervention will happen, who will do the intervening. There's a whole debate on the African continent about the fact that the International Criminal Court seems to have a lot of cases going on in Africa, so why aren't there cases somewhere else? Is this just another form of neo-colonialism? Certainly, countries like China play into that argument very, very strongly. I think we need to separate out two issues. One is, are rights, is there a universality to rights or not? And the example that I use is rights for the LGBT community that we have decided needs to be something that we celebrate and express in our way of life. When I travel overseas, I go to Myanmar, if I go to any part of the world, I meet people who are gay. it's not to say there are no gay people in Iran, or there are no gay people in India, or there are no gay people in China. There are. There are gay people everywhere. So it's not that those rights are not universal, and they want to have rights. They want to be able to live their life without going to jail, without being killed, without being executed. So, I happen to believe that those rights are universal. I believe that very strongly. What is differentiated is the oppression. The oppression takes a variety of forms in different countries through different cultures. That's what's not universal. And I guess my simple answer, because it's such a long conversation on the issue of intervention, is difficult to do. It only really works if the consequences of intervention are less bad than the consequences of not intervening. And that's the test that we have to apply. It's not to say, should we, if you look, for example, at the recent examples of intervention in Libya, in Iraq, in Syria, you have to say to yourself, well, in Syria you say, well, was there intervention? Not really. Was it effective? No. It's complicated. I would argue that our failure to intervene in Syria effectively has cost a lot of lives. It cost far more lives than the cost of not intervening. It was politically more convenient not to intervene, but that doesn't mean it wasn't costly for the people of Syria. So when people say to me, "Oh, these rights aren't universal," well, go talk to a newspaper publisher in Iran and ask him or her, do you think your rights are universal? Ask a woman in Iran how she feels about the nature of the oppression which she's subject to. I really do believe there's a universality of the human personality and of the human condition. I think what differentiates countries, unfortunately, is the nature of the oppression that people are living under.
The back mic, please. Yep.
I'm going to propose something that I consider to be a big crisis for the task that you are faced with, and it's a crisis that not only is Myanmar, but it's Aboriginal issues, Syrian issues, things of that nature. This is anecdotal, but I get that I feel that there is a fairly substantial population in the country who would be, these folks never went to university. They have labor jobs, and that's kind of the life that they live. And they don't really read books very much, that kind of thing. There's probably a lot of people in the country that kind of meet this description, and they have access to Facebook these days, and I know a fair amount of these folks. I'm from rural New Brunswick, and there is certainly different than over the past decades. You might have more experience with that than me. The misinformation, probably for a long time, the left misunderstood the right, and the right misunderstood the left, and maybe almost with intention. But it seems now that the degree of just bizarre, what they consider to be understandings and happenings, is getting more disparate. It's going very far afield, and I guess it's very hard to untangle.
Yes.
And most people don't have the bandwidth to even want to begin to talk about whether or not they have arrived at a proper conclusion or not. What do you have to say about a potential crisis with opinion?
I think you make an absolutely excellent point. Last night, I gave a talk, not totally dissimilar, but not exactly the same as this one I'm giving tonight on the issue of human rights in the age of populism. And what you're describing is the age of populism. What you're describing are opinions that people have that are based on their own experience, in which they're uncomfortable with a certain amount of social change, they're uncomfortable with economic dislocation, and they're prepared to believe those who tell them that if we if we do this, you'll be better off. And we all know that there are demagogues and people who are prepared to play to and pander to those opinions and views and feelings. Yeah, we live in a difficult age. I mean, Doug Ford is the premier of my province. I know all about that. I mean, I've seen it happen. And people say, oh, you know, they used to have debates on the CBC. Could we ever have a Trump in Canada? Well, hey, you know, looks to me like, you know, and I think we have to be aware. Look at the election result in New Brunswick. You know, what does that tell you about where opinion is and where feelings are? So yes, everyone in public life has to be aware that, you know, there are in the broad general public, there are lots of views and lots of opinions. And the path that I'm describing is not one that everybody agrees with. It's contested, and that's great. But all I'm saying is don't give up. Like, don't just say, oh, well, you know, there's too many on the other side of the debate, so I'm not going to even present the argument. I think we have to continue to present the argument. I am an unashamed globalist. I believe profoundly that the world is getting smaller. I don't think the gap between us and the rest of the world and our neighbors is a gap that can never be resolved. I don't think the nation state on its own can resolve all our problems. You can't solve climate change. You can't, you know, global warming, okay? You know, it's not just New Brunswick warming or Canada warming or Toronto warming, it's global warming. So we have to be part of that process, but it doesn't stop at our borders. So you're absolutely right. I mean, I think, for example, the anger and frustration with what happened in Afghanistan and Iraq in our country and in the United States and in the United Kingdom and in Europe led directly to the complete failure to respond to what was happening in Syria. Like total abnegation of responsibility for dealing with it. Even President Obama said, you know, this is a red line. And they crossed the red line and nothing happened. There were no consequences. So, yeah, was he affected by opinion? Absolutely, he was affected by opinion.
I think we have time left for 2 questions. So I'm going to take 1 question from the first mic, 1 question from the back mic, and that's unfortunately all we're going to have for tonight. So thank you for everyone who's asking questions. So, sir, at the front mic, please. You're at the front mic, yep.
Thanks.
You're in the front line, you just don't know it yet.
Yeah.
Yes. I really appreciate your looking at issues through the lens being consequential, ethical, and practical. That's going to sit with me for a long time. In light of that, the Canadian response to the women who are being held in Saudi Arabia, and by pointing out that issue versus going elsewhere and choosing between what's right and what's right, what would you have done? Thank you.
Well, you're going to get me fired very quickly. I think the question is you have to be consistent. And we need to understand that, for example, the failure to recognize the rights of women is not unique to one country or another. There are many, many countries of the world which do not recognize the equality of women. I think what the government and the minister were responding to was a particular situation where there was a series of arrests which the government felt had real consequences for a number of other things that they saw going on inside Saudi Arabia. But again, not to belabor the point, we need to understand that to every response, there's going to be a counter response. You can't simply get on a pulpit and say this is the way it's going to be and expect people to say, oh, thank you very much, we didn't know that. And so governments are going to respond accordingly, and we need to understand that these things are not just sort of one-off things that make you feel better. Every tweet gets a retweet, and every tort gets a retort, and you got to understand that's the nature of life. So, I mean, when we talk to our kids and our grandchildren about, what's right and what's wrong, I know if you go into the schoolyard and you say, that's wrong, and then the bigger kid comes up and shoves you, and you come home and say, what happened? I said he was wrong, and he was wrong. And so we don't live in a just world. We live in a world where working for justice is a constant effort. So we need to understand that if we're serious about wanting to do the right thing, there will be consequences to that. And nobody should be surprised or shocked. I think the only shock in Canada was to say, I never knew we had so many Saudi students in our hospitals. Like our entire residential programs across the country seem to depend on the fact that we have Saudis paying extra money to our universities and provinces for the privilege of working in our hospitals. I'm not opposed to it, but I think it was a bit of a revelation for a lot of us to say, wow, I didn't know that. Yeah, go ahead.
Do any examples come to mind of successful interventions? What does a successful intervention look like? And in the case of Myanmar, what is the best case scenario? What would be the ideal kind of way of intervening in that situation that could actually lead to an end to the violence there?
Well, I think we have to recognize that as painful as the process in the former Yugoslavia was, and as imperfect as it was, and as violent as it was in many respects, and as destructive of property as it was in some respects, I think we have to realize that we did restore a degree of protection for a population, the Kosovars. We have seen a greater degree of dialogue and understanding, and it's been painful, and it has not been perfect, but it has taken place. I think the transition to democracy in South Africa is one of the miracles of modern times. It doesn't mean there aren't significant issues in South Africa today or that there aren't serious problems. But, that's a couple, and I think we can probably sit down and think about it. We can think of a lot more. Don't take it from my perspective that I'm an advocate of pure and simple intervention. I'm not. I'm a strong believer in the importance of engagement and the importance of saying that there are times and circumstances in which some forms of intervention, including military intervention, will actually be better than the alternatives. And we're not very good at figuring this out because the process of getting there is so messy and it's so argumentative. But I do think there's ways we could go forward. Well, it's very easy for us to say what we think the answers in Myanmar should be, but I do think it's a common view among a lot of people that, and most notably the late Kofi Annan, who wrote a report on the situation in Rakhine before the forcible deportation of the 750,000 Rohingya. And that was that there needed to be a process by which the Rohingya could become part of the country. And that, when I talk to the people in camps in Bangladesh, which are really terrible places, by the way, in terms of the quality of life that people are being asked to live through, there's no doubt as to where their home is. Their home is not in Bangladesh. Their home is in Myanmar. That's their home. That's the land that they've known, they've tilled for generations, and they know that that's theirs and it belongs to them. They think of that as being their home. So just as we say in the Middle East, the answer is for Israelis and Palestinians to come together and understand that both nations have a right to coexist, to peaceful coexistence, and that Israel has a right to live in secure borders and to be able to flourish, and the Palestinians have a right to live in secure borders and to be able to flourish. And those two rights are not in their very nature, they're not in conflict. They are in conflict because of all of the things that have happened and have gotten in the way and continue to impede any serious negotiation between the two countries. The same is true in Myanmar. I mean, I believe that a political solution, every sort of humanitarian crisis has the element of a political solution, and the political solution is some kind of federal structure for Myanmar, some kind of structure that recognizes the rights of a number of different groups and ethnic territories, and that frankly includes the Rohingya in that family. The continuing exclusion of the Rohingya and the risk that there will be further exclusion of the several 100,000 Rohingya who are still in Rakhine, who are living very precariously at the moment, if they are expelled or if something worse happens to them, then we're in even deeper trouble. And we need to understand that and the consequences of that. So it's not very hard from the outside to say this looks to me like the kind of thing that people should be thinking about. But my experiences in many different countries is that military governments don't do federalism very well. They're thinking really almost exclusively in kind of, control and repress theories of how you deal with disputes. And we know that that hasn't worked, that it's created problems in every border area in Thailand and in China and everywhere else. But that nevertheless is why it's still happening. Why is it? Well, because they have power and they don't want to lose power. And the peaceful transition to a non-military state is not something that's easy to achieve. Some countries achieve it, other countries are still not able to achieve it. But there's no doubt in my mind that is sort of the basic direction you want to go in. But how that happens is really up to the people who are living there. The problem is that if 60% or 65 or 70% are in one ethnic group and they say this is the way we want it to be, well, it's tough for the other 30%. And that's the situation that we're all living in. I mean, we're very lucky as a country. We've made some good decisions. We made some bad decisions as a country. We made some good decisions as a country where we've said, we're going to let different people live in different parts of the country and have a greater degree of control. And it's frustrating and not easy. It's messy. But that is something I think as Canadians we can say, yeah, this is sort of our experience. And this tells us that's a better way to go. But when we do that, we also have to look exactly in the mirror and say, yeah, but we haven't exactly figured out all of the answers. Well, so when people come to me and say, we'd like to know how does your federal structure work? And you say, well, it kind of works. But most working federations have a second chamber that actually isn't appointed by the central government, when you look at it. And you say, and the Indigenous situation, if you compare us with New Zealand or Australia or the United States or many Latin American countries, we're not doing great on any world scale. We can't look in the mirror and say, we're way ahead of the pack here. We're not. We're not ahead of the pack. Although Nova Scotia is actually ahead of the Canadian pack in some significant ways in terms of education and progress that's being made. And that's for some particular historical reasons about how the relative size of Nova Scotia and the fact that people are living very closely together, and that after a lot of conflict, I have to say the results tend to indicate that Nova Scotia has made significant progress compared to many other parts of the country in terms of the situation facing Indigenous people in this province. So thanks very much, everybody. I really appreciate the chance.
Have a seat.
Great to see you. Great to see you. Thanks for coming.
I'm going to ask the president of St. Mary's University to step up in a second just to close the proceedings. I'll just make a couple of quick notes. Thanks so much to SISEPA for working with the McEachern Institute on this event. I think it's been another roaring success, and we really appreciate your support. We also want to thank all the other sponsors who've supported this event. Mr. Rae for coming, of course, but I want to just make this very practical note that Chris Stover has told me from time to time about SISEPA events. Our speakers suck people into the front because everyone wants to talk to our speaker, and then the speaker never gets to the back foyer where he's supposed to be meeting people. So, if I may ask that you just head that way towards the door, and we'll make sure that Mr. Rae gets up there to meet some people who would like to share a word with Mr. Rae. But please don't come down, go that way. Okay? So if you can just keep that in mind. And on that note, I'll hand it over to Dr. Robert Summersby Murray to close the stage for tonight.
Well, thank you, Kevin, and thank you again, Mr. Rae. On behalf of SISEPA, the McEachern Institute at Dalhousie University, St. Mary's University, the Canadian International Council, and the Centre for Security and Development at Dalhousie, I'd like to thank you, Bob, for a provocative presentation tonight. I think, to me, by framing your talk in the context of what I would describe as the Hobbesian dilemma, you have given us a provocative essay on the conflicting, challenging intersections between pragmatics and hope, between ethics and the rule of law, and have demonstrated the importance of complexity in this. And by setting it in an historical perspective as well, I think you've also provided a call to action for us in 2018. One could spend time analysing the time of Hobbes and the sense of life being nasty, brutish and short, but applying that to 2018 and framing the phrase as you did, the fragility of the architecture that we are using to manage the situation in 2018. I expect what you've done is given us a call to action around that fragility by speaking to the absence of institutions or the challenges to institutions, and those are institutions of government, of the courts, of leadership, of universities, of places of worship, of political process. By framing that fragility for us tonight, you have issued a call to action for us, and I think we owe you a considerable debt for that. That's clearly my signal to shut down. But the good news, and I'm hoping the lights will come back on, is that in issuing this call to action, I'm reminded most particularly of that immortal quote of Sir Winston Churchill, which was simply, never give up, never give up, never give up. And indeed, that's the very positive message that I take away from your presentation this evening. Finally, though, I want to just close on one point in relation to your comments, and that is that we are extremely excited by the not so subtle hints of a political comeback. We do suggest we are suggesting, of course, that you don't wait until age 94, but you move on this sooner rather than later. So at this point, though, I would like to thank our audience this evening. I'd like to thank those of you who have joined us by live stream this evening as well, and for your participation in a thoughtful Q&A. On your desks, you will find an evaluation form. This is particularly important for us. It allows us to explore pertinent and relevant themes for the future. I think you will agree from hearing tonight's lecture that there are many compelling elements of public ethics that remain to have future and further exploration. Also, at the back of the room, you'll find a number of pieces of information in relation to SISEPA, its past events, DVDs, past programs, etc., and as well as information on upcoming programs. Please join us for a reception in the lobby afterwards. I would like as well at this point to thank our SISEPA staff for their superb organisation of this event and for the dinner that preceded it. And finally, please join me again in thanking tonight's speaker, the Honourable Bob Rae. Thank you.